Hey guys, it's Peschu. Welcome to my channel. Today we are going to have another lesson on price elasticity of demand. We are going to continue the trend that we did with the past few lessons, and we're going to focus on different applications of price elasticity of demand. The topic of today's video will be price elasticity of demand and commodities. So we are going to examine what kind of elasticity do commodities have, and we'll see some practical applications that occur as a consequence of those elasticities. So let's get started. The first thing that we need to do is to actually look at the three different types of commodities that we can generally observe. So commodities are products, and we split them into three groups. We call these primary, secondary, and finally, obviously, tertiary. Now, what are these? Primary commodities are those products which grow naturally in the world. So anything like natural resources, wildlife, fish, agricultural products, those will be considered primary commodities. So we can say agricultural goods, livestock, fish, resources. Okay, now the secondary commodities are those products which require to undergo some kind of processing or manufacturing in order to be completed. So these would be things that do not naturally appear in the world, and we need to take some resources and labor, do some manufacturing, and then they will appear. So just manufactured goods. Manufactured goods. So for example, consumer electronics, cars, clothes, all of these would be secondary commodities. Finally, we have the last group, tertiary, and these will be intangible products. Intangible products or services sometimes. Well, services is the most common word. We call them intangible simply because they have some use value, they have utility, but it's not something physical that you can just grab. For example, getting a haircut or going to a restaurant and ordering a meal. When you order the meal, you will receive a cooked dish, which is a secondary commodity by nature because it has undergone some processing, but you also need to take into consideration the fact that somebody cooked that dish, and that's a service that the restaurant performed for you. So those are the three types of commodities that we generally have, and now each of them will have a specific elasticity. Now, generally speaking, primary commodities tend to be inelastic. So tend to be inelastic. Now, notice that I'm using the verb tend. We are doing this because you may find some exceptions to the general rule, but primary commodities in nature tend to have inelastic price elasticity of demand. Now, why does that happen? To analyze this, we're going to use the same approach that we did in the lesson where we examined the determinants of price elasticity of demand. Primary commodities, and you can think of it as natural resources, have very little substitutes available. If you need a certain resource for your manufacturing, there's very little alternatives that you generally can get. Yes, due to development of technologies and other scientific advances, we can use some scientific alternatives, but most of the time, if you need a specific resource, you have very little options to switch it and use something else. Secondary products, on the other hand, tend to have elastic price elasticity of demand. So these tend to have elastic PED. Okay, so these tend to be inelastic PED. These tend, okay, so primary with inelastic PED, secondary manufactured good with elastic PED. The reason why manufactured goods usually have elastic price elasticity of demand is that we can now find many substitutes for them. Think about any consumer electronic that you may have at home. You have an electronic from brand A, but brand A may be offering 5 or 6 different models. At the same time, there's also brand B, C, D, and so on, which are also coming with different models all the time. So that will create a lot of substitutes. Also, primary commodities in nature tend to be relatively cheap, simply because they have not undergone any specific processing most of the time. And thus there is no value added to them. But secondary commodities, because they have undergone manufactured processing, tend to be more expensive. So if we remember that one of the determinants of price elasticity of demand was the price as a proportion of income, we generally are going to see that the price as a proportion of income of secondary commodities usually tends to be higher than for primary commodities. And again, I'm saying usually. You can find exemptions to that rule, but if you consider, let's say, a car and buying a kilogram of apples, the car is clearly the expensive choice or the expensive item. Finally, we can look at tertiary commodities, and these once again tend to have elastic price elasticity of demand. And they have elastic price elasticity of demand precisely because when you look at the services sectors, usually there is a lot of competition, and that competition leads to many available and similar items. So a lot of substitutes will be available on the market. When you decide to go get a haircut, chances are you can pretty much go to any hair salon and they will do the same job. When you decide to go on a vacation, you can choose between different touristic agencies, but you will still go on the same location to the same hotel, enjoy the same services. When you decide to fly from point A to point B, you can do that with a number of different airlines, but at the end of the day, you're still flying from point A to point B. So because of that high level of competitiveness, tertiary products tend to have elastic price elasticity of demand. Now, like I said, there are exceptions to these rules. These are not firm and set in stone, but this is the general trend. Now, what is the consequence of this type of behavior of the demand and its price elasticity? Well, we can do that. One way to see how different firms will be impacted is by comparing actually a situation for each of these markets when the supply is changing and how that will affect the price. So let's show a few diagrams. All right, so because secondary and tertiary products tend to have elastic demand, I'm going to use one diagram to illustrate both tertiary and secondary products, and then I'll have a separate diagram for primary products. So over here we have primary, and this would be secondary and tertiary price. Okay, so this is a demand for a primary product, and this is a demand for a product that is either secondary or tertiary. It doesn't matter. But what we need to realize is that the price elasticity over here would be inelastic. So I'm gonna have PED is less than 1. And over here, I'm gonna have elastic price elasticity of demand. And if you don't understand how to estimate the price elasticity of demand by looking at the demand curve, you can look up my first video on price elasticity of demand, where I actually showed that the value of PED can vary along a straight demand line. And I show how to estimate what would be the value simply by looking at the demand curve. Okay, now to illustrate the difference in behavior, I'm going to add now two supply curves on each graph. So I'm going to have an increase in supply from S0 to S1. And again, a similar increase in supply from S0 to S1. Okay, let's analyze and see how these two frames will be impacted. In both situations, we have a demand curve and an equivalent increase in the supply. If we look at the primary commodity, what we are going to see is a relatively large decline at the price level, and a small increase in the quantity. When we look at the secondary and tertiary products, we are going to see a relatively small decline in the price level and a relatively large increase in the quantity. So this is the first difference that we automatically notice. Prices change over here more dramatically. So we have more dramatic price change. Also notice what's happening to the total revenue of these two firms. When we look at the primary commodity, because of the decline in the price, these firms will lose this much of total revenue and will gain this much. So comparing the two areas, we can see that total revenue is falling. When we look at the secondary or tertiary product, we can see that from the increase in supply and decline in the price, these firms will lose this much total revenue, but will gain this much. So as a result, we can see that the total revenue is rising. Now, you may say, well, what if the other way happens around? What if the supply begins to decline, and then how can we... You may ask yourself, however, what if the opposite happens? What if the supply is decreasing? Well, if the supply is decreasing, clearly this one will be experiencing an increase in the total revenue, and this one will be experiencing a decrease in the total revenue. However, what we are more likely to observe in real life is that because of technological advancements, we discover better means of manufacturing things, which generally leads to an increase in supply. And once again, because of technological advancements, we find better means to extract natural resources, which can also lead to contribute to an increase in the supply of these products. So all we know, if we now compare the two situations, we see that primary commodities tend to have volatile prices because the prices are changing quite often. We see that the equivalent change in the supply leads to a bigger change in the price when compared to secondary and tertiary products. So these have stable prices, and stable prices, guys, means less risk. So this is less riskier than this one. This is riskier than the secondary and tertiary. So we have stable prices, less risk, and an increase in the supply because of the elastic price elasticity of demand leads to an increase in total revenue. With primary commodities, on the other hand, so we have volatile prices, riskier investment, and finally an increase in supply leads to a decline in the total revenue. So once again, we see that probably if you're considering doing some kind of investment, firms will probably focus more on secondary and tertiary items, which also explains why economies naturally progress towards secondary and tertiary sectors as they grow. When you see small economies, usually they tend to be agrarian based, which is your primary sector. And when you see more advanced and developed economies, they tend to be more secondary and tertiary oriented because, again, less risk. As supply increases, total revenue increases, and prices are more stable. Alright guys, I hope you liked this lesson. If you did, please hit the like button. If you have any questions, please post them in the comments section. Let me know if you want me to do any other lessons. And if you want, subscribe to the channel. I hope I see you again. Take care.